Welcome back to Falling Walls Breakthrough Conversations. We have created this space so that we can have conversations with global leaders, outstanding scientists, emerging innovators, and science entrepreneurs. We're looking at their research, their career paths, and just generally their experiences. The digital audience is encouraged throughout to ask their own questions, not just listen to my questions. I'll explain in just 1 second how to do that, but first to introduce myself. I am science journalist and communicator Adam Levy, and I think this is my 5th or 6th year involved with Falling Walls, and it's really great to be back. Now, the special thing about Falling Walls Breakthrough Conversations is that it's not just a conversation between me and our excellent guests, but you can also take part. Now, how to do that? Just use the raise your hand feature within Zoom. So not literally raising your hand, but there's a feature within Zoom. Once you've done that, you will be highlighted, put in the spotlight, and you will be unmuted when I ask for your question. After your question, you'll be muted again. So if you have a follow-up question, just go through that whole process again, raise your hand, and we'll get to your question as quickly as possible. If you have any technical difficulties, just drop them in the chat. I think that's all the admin I need to mention, except that this conversation will be recorded and viewable after the event. So let's turn now to the actual conversation. And I'm joined now by Michèle Lamont, who is Professor of Sociology and African-American Studies at Harvard University. Thank you so much for joining us, Michèle.
Thank you for inviting me.
Now, Michèle is investigating how powerful ideas of inclusion and destigmatization are propagating through our world. Now, what is changing over recent years and recent decades when it comes to these ideas and their acceptance?
Well, it's a long process. I think throughout history, different groups have sought to be included. I think of the women's vote, for instance, that characterized a lot of the history of the 20th century. Over the last few years, we've had the largest demonstration in the history of the world that could be documented, and movements such as Black Lives Matter and Me Too have really, have had global reach. So that's a big difference. In the current moment, your generation, the millennials, the Gen Zs, are really taking on inclusion and diversity as their banners. So I think while a lot of the politics in the 60s, 70s, previous decades were about redistributing resources, now you have slogans such as "I see you" that become also a claim to matter and to broaden the circle of who matters. So it's more like an intensification of this movement. And since the last summer in the US, you've seen also a very large movement of cohort replacement at the Poetry Foundation, for instance. The old guys who were in place were dislodged and replaced by new cohort of more woke people who are more connected with urban poetry. So in many other cultural industries, there's a sea change in leadership that really makes, inclusion and diversity take the center stage. So that's a historical change.
Now, just how widespread has this transition been? It's easy perhaps for someone like me to feel like it's very widespread, but I'm very aware that we all live in our bubbles these days. So can you give a sense of just how much these ideas have propagated?
Well, I'm not studying it across society at large. One thing we know is recognition claims are across the political spectrum. We can think about the in the US, we talk about the incel patriots, the involuntary celibates who are keeping distance from politics, but who are in fact extremely political and supportive of Trump often. They claim to not be political, but they are. And the recognition claims that are made by the downwardly mobile working class are not necessarily acknowledged as the same kind of yearning for respect that is expressed by Black Lives Matter. So it takes different channels, and in both cases, you have a lot of philanthropies and funders that are joining in to scale up the messages. So that's happening on both sides. And the public sphere is now being reconfigured with the social media, a lot of professionalization of messaging and of narratives that has accelerated enormously with the technologies that are now brought in to test the performance of different kinds of messages and really to scale them up with digital tools that we didn't have before. So it makes a huge difference.
I'm really glad you mentioned this other side of the coin, as it were, and I really want to come back to that in a moment. But before we get to that, I want to ask maybe a more fundamental question, which is, why is this happening? Why is this transition underway? And is that process coming top down, bottom up, or is it really impossible to draw that kind of distinction with something like this?
Well, in the American case, there's the fact that growing inequality has made the American dream unreachable now for most people. So what has served as a kind of escalator for the American population since World War II is now declared bankrupt by many, many young people who can see that they cannot buy a house, they certainly cannot go to college. So then you need new kinds of ideas that will give people hope. And the embrace of a diversity of identity, whether ethno-racial or religious or sexual, has now really taken root as a way to, celebrate, you do your thing, be you, as a new way of understanding where happiness comes from. And it also, there's an acknowledgement that therapeutic culture has had now deep, influence. So the blind pursuit of power or, material success is losing a lot of steam in its appeal. So the process of, gaining status is something that is fundamental to societies, but there's many venues. And you can have societies where one kind of currency counts, let's say make a lot of money, and you can have other societies where you have a plurality of values that are, celebrated. And I think we're moving slowly in this direction where there's more of a celebration of people's ability to do their own thing, whatever it is.
Now, do you see your job, I guess, as a sociologist, just to stand back and observe and understand these changes? Mm-hmm. Or do you see your job as in some way to influence and maybe perpetrate these changes through society in some way?
Yeah, very much the latter, to the extent that this accepting to give this talk is also an opportunity to help people understand that we create the seeds of change every day by, the kind of narratives that we put in place. And me as a sociologist, my narrative is to help people understand that changing group boundaries is a social accomplishment that we do together. It is within our realm, and there's a lot of social actors that contribute to making them more rigid or more porous. And just to help people think, okay, this is not just Darwinism at work, that we make the society we live in is kind of my contribution to social change.
I'd be really interested to explore what these ideas mean in a particular context, and why not choose your university, the University of Harvard, which, when people think of Harvard, of course, they think of academic excellence, but they also think of long-standing traditions and maybe maybe quite rigorous social structures within a university like that. Are we seeing these kinds of transitions playing out within the walls of Harvard as well?
Yeah, 15 years ago or so, was it maybe 10, the president then put in place a need-blind admission, which means that if you are admitted, you're accepted even if you cannot pay. And that led to a diversification of our student body with many more students who are first generation, that is, their parents didn't go to college. And it's been really a tweaking process. One of my former graduate students wrote his dissertation on those first gen, that the book is called The Privileged Poor. And it shows how the many ways in which the university was blind to the problems that first gen students encountered. Like, for instance, spring break, they would close all the cafeterias. And then one of his interviewees say, I started going on the dating app because that's the only way I could be fed for a week. You know, the student didn't have a lot of money to spend in restaurant. So the university took so much for granted that their student body had a lot of resources, came from, you know, middle-class background, that it didn't attend to the need of a lot of low-income students. So this is in the process of being discussed now. It's really, the students are much more vocal about mental health challenges that come from the fact that they feel that they may not belong if they are, you know, people of color or whatever. So the university is learning to listen much better. Of course, there's an enormous amount of work to do ahead still, but long gone are the days when the university just embraced its hyper-elite, satisfied self-image, I think.
Long gone or recently gone?
Well, yeah, recently gone. And it's like the current dean, it's very matters who's a dean. She's an African-American woman. There's been a number of famous cases of sexual harassment in the last few years, and she's fired the guilty men, and she's been very aggressive in pushing back. Like, hopefully the next dean will be as clear about what behavior is acceptable or not. But I think with her, we're moving away from a good old boy network of I protect your back, you protect mine. Hopefully it will be long lasting indeed. We cannot say long gone yet, you're totally right.
Now, when these ideas spread, as these ideas are spreading, that's not a neutral process. And we've seen very clearly in America and elsewhere that there's a huge backlash and a huge political capitalization on resistance to these ideas. How does one begin to work around that or respond to that?
Well, I think one important step is to understand where the backlash comes from and really work on thinking about contexts where it's not going to be zero-sum. It's not because LGBTQ people gain rights that the blue-collar working class is losing status. And that's where I think the role of social scientists is crucial in, explaining how you can foster a culture where you have a plurality of types of people who can coexist, how to engineer societies that are more accepting. And a lot of people are pushing empathy. I'm not a big fan of this. To me, it's too much like goody-goody, I think you can literally engineer situations where it's less zero-sum. So let's say same-sex marriage laws in the U.S. led to a decline in number of LGBTQ youth who were attempting suicide in the high school to decline dramatically. So this is a law that does not take anything away from others, but affirms the rights of a wider range of people. Now, some people certainly feel threatened by it, but it's a little bit like, I think, as the changes are taking root little by little, there's a question about also the speed at which the changes are, changes is coming surely, slowly but surely.
Well, you say that it's not taking anything away from people, but a lot of people think these things are taking something away from them, and a lot of politicians and media personalities really let's say, stoke those fires. And, for example, for inclusion of same-sex loving people or for trans people, these have been used to, I suppose, to present a threat to people.
Yeah.
And so I guess there's a difference between it not actually posing a threat and people feeling like it poses a threat. Yeah.
And one of the changes that is having an impact, I'm going to talk about this afternoon, shows like Transparent that made visible and humanized and dignified how trans people are presented. And this is a show on Amazon that represents an older middle-aged man who negotiates with his adult children after he comes out as queer. And it really shows the human dilemma and the fact that this guy just wants to have a nice relationship with his children, which is something that everyone can recognize as a basic human impulse, to be close to your children. So I interviewed the Joey Soloway, who's the creator of the show, and they say that the main goal is really to make people relate, and they created the show to deal with their own shame, and the goal is, they talk about the goal of the show very much in terms of destigmatization and trying to make people understand. So realizing such a show provides, and that's my whole argument, is about the diffusion of cultural models and cultural templates through which people can then interpret reality through new schemas. So that's where I'm saying, the stigmatization is socially engineered. And once you understand that there's a whole industry engaged in the production of narrative, and these narrative can be directed in some direction versus others, then you really can contribute to cultivate, a larger definition of who matters in society. So that's the book I'm working on now, basically makes this argument, for which we've interviewed like 74 stand-up comics and Hollywood creative. I mean, I've interviewed, my team and I, people from all kinds of cultural industries who are every day planting seeds. So I would say the distinctive contribution of this project is very much to study the process of creation of social change as it happens. So
I'm just going to pass over to our audience because I think we have an audience question. You should be unmuted now, and please go ahead.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting to follow your discussion. My question is, do you think that there appear to be more challenges to achieve inclusivity in digital spaces? And what do you think are the different challenges for that space?
That's such a good question. The digital space includes so many things. There's a channel that a platform that I talk about in the book, Patreon, which is an organization that allows all kinds of creators to post their material on it, and you can support them with $5 a month. So it allows a lot of artists and creators to make a living with their work. One of the shows on it is something called Chapo Trap House, which is one of the main diffusers of basically leftist culture in the U.S., enormously popular podcast. It would never have been possible without Patreon. So that part, I think, the creation of streaming services such as Patreon, same thing with Netflix, the explosion of streaming has created an enormous amount of diversity, and which contributes to pluralism. When it comes to the use of social media, Twitter, Instagram, we all know the amount of moral shaming and canceling that occurs. For the book, we've also interviewed 80 Gen Zs, young people between 18 and 22. They talk a lot about the many ways in which they find it paralyzing to constantly have to present themselves in a favorable light, and the moral judgments that people are making very, very rapidly in relation. And I would say of our respondents, young people of color are talking about this with much more concern than middle-class white kids. So the patterns across. So Black Twitter is enormously active, but it's also very very strong prescription. You have to have an opinion. You have to show up in the street. If you don't show up in the street, you're bad. You're a bad person. So I think it goes both ways. We know from the Arab Spring and on the powerful impact of the social media on collective mobilization. But there's also a lot of paralyzing effect as well. Overall, I think it's more positive than negative, but we will see.
I'd like to come back now to a point you raised right near the beginning of our conversation, which was this idea that, for example, people who identify as incels, which is short for involuntary celibates, and I suppose that's a subcategory of men's rights activists who position themselves very much in opposition to feminist ideas, how these people actually share quite a lot with the kind of wokeness that we're talking about, when I'm sure both people who would self-identify as woke and these incels would see themselves as having nothing in common. Can you elaborate on what these two kind of polar opposites?
So I think what they have in common is a need for recognition. And what is not happening is people who participate in woke culture who would like to recognize as mattering, as, you know, members of a stigmatized group, name it, and that the incels are also claiming recognition. They feel invisible. Many of them are not participating in any surveys. They're trying to live below the radar. If they participate in politics, it's as trolls, anonymously on the social media. So they are very destructive in terms of collective life. So now, how do you address that? You know, I think it's one thing to address the stigmatization of trans by, you know, depicting and providing narrative on their life. It's quite another thing to figure out how to present incels more positively. But you think of portraits of the working class, you know, they're very, very rare currently on entertainment television. And when the working class is presented, they're also, the men are morons, they're clowns, they're stupid. Think of The Simpsons. So the vast majority of all characters are middle-class people, and it reproduces the same notion of, you know, meritocracy. The college-educated people are the one who get access to all the goods, and the losers, the working class, feel more and more marginal, and then it's easier for them to just embrace, as is the case in the US and in Germany probably as well. I mean, I know with the neo-Nazi, you know, patriotism as, you know, a way to hold on to the one high status signal. So I'm not justifying in any way what they're doing and saying, but I'm saying we have to understand that this, the desire to gain recognition and to be treated as you matter is across the board. When it comes to the work of the social scientists, who tend to be a little bit disdainful of you know, those who are not college educated. Well, I guess my own work is also to try to tell my peers that we have to be much more attuned to the parallel in the needs that are driving this kind of behavior. The big problem, of course, is if it's zero-sum, if they think that they can only increase their status by kicking the immigrants out or making it more of a white society, if you will, this is where, you know, it's you end up in a dead end. But the social change are not, you know, the steps are taken a little bit every day, and I think it adds up at the end of the day. So
I think we're very close to being out of time, but just before the voice in my ear tells me to wrap it up, I'd really like to ask, I mean, we focused a lot on the situation in the present.
Yeah.
Right? What is your hope for what the future will bring, what these movements could bring to us in the coming decades?
Well, I really see it. The context I study, in the American context, there's no question that the change is unfolding very, very, very fast. And it is seen, it is visible when you look at all the leading philanthropies that have decided to have, you know, racial justice as their main focus for the next several years, who's being elected at presidential, you know, professional associations, universities, who's being chosen as presidents and deans. So I mean, the US is changing very, very rapidly. And in the American context, it's mostly about race and sexuality as well. In the context of Canada, I know Indigenous rights is much more at the forefront. People don't talk about race as much. I think each society has very different configurations of exclusion, and each of them is dealing with very, very different problems. So I don't know enough about Germany to know. I know that climate change in France, and here too, I think that's much more the forefront than it is in the U.S. In the U.S., there are alliances, but you know, it's not as mobilizing as it is in Germany, certainly.
as with all the conversations today, I feel like this conversation could take another couple of hours.
That's true.
Sadly, the next conversation will get in the way of that. So thank you so much for joining us and sharing your ideas. And the next conversation will start very, very soon, in fact, in just 5 minutes. So stay tuned for that. That will be with Gerhard Wiedmer. So yeah, stay tuned, and the next conversation will begin shortly.